Hi, Matt.
Last time we talked about the Late Bronze Age. Today we're going to start our discussion of the Iron Age with the Iron One period, which is a very important period at Megiddo. In particular, last time we ended with the destruction or the slow pullout of Egypt and the slow destruction of Megiddo at the end of the Late Bronze Age. But in many ways, the Iron One is something of a continuation of that. So I want to hit some of those themes as we're going on today. Give us the geographical background, because of course we're in this period between the city-states of the Late Bronze Age and looking forward toward the Iron Two when we have these big territorial kingdoms. What does the geography say about how all of that gets moving?
So yes, exactly. I think that the most important feature that you mentioned is the fact that we are now shifting from the city-states of the Bronze Age to something very different of the Iron Age, which means the rise of the territorial kingdoms. And the beginning of the Iron Age is just in between, somewhere there. So let me first start with perhaps giving some background. In the beginning of the Iron Age, we archaeologists call this phase the Iron One, Iron Age One. And it covers the Iron Age One, the period between, let's say, the late 12th century BC and the middle of the 10th century. So this is a period of about 2 centuries, the intermediate period between this world of Canaan, of the city-states of the late Bronze Age, and the ancient Israel with the rise of the territorial kingdoms, including Israel and Judah, of course, and the other kingdoms, the Arameans and Moab and Ammon and so on. We have basically in the Iron One the rise of these groups in the highlands, especially in the highlands. That is to say, the rise of ancient Israel, the first indications for this wave of settlement in the highlands, which brought about the rise of ancient Israel and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This is in the highlands. Then in the southern coastal plain, or along the coast, we have the arrival of groups from the Aegean basin. Not very many people, but groups that took control over the city-states. Especially known among them are the Philistines, mentioned in the Bible, of course, and also these groups are mentioned in Egyptian records of the time of Ramesses III in the beginning of the 12th century BC. So we know quite a lot about them, perhaps less than we would have wished, but we know. And they settled along the coast with the Philistines in the south. And then the rest of the country, especially in the lowlands, there's some sort of continuity, we'll speak about it, of Canaanite life, re-emergence or continuity, depends how you look at it. So these are the 3 parts of the country: Israelites, Judahites, Moabites, Ammonites, all these new nations rising, but of course from the local stock. I mean, we are not speaking about many people coming from outside. I mean, this is not what we are describing. We are speaking about the local population, but something happens that they become, I mean, these Canaanites in parts become Israelites, and these Canaanites in other areas become Moabites, if you wish, or Ammonites. There are new groups along the coast, but also local people, so which means there is no replacement of population, of course. They take control over these cities such as Ashkelon and Ekron and Gaza along the coast. And then the Canaanites, so to speak, the local population continues here. So this is the background. Now the dates, as I mentioned to you, between the 12th century and the 10th century BC.
Let's turn to Megiddo itself now.
Sure. So Megiddo itself, the situation is the following. We spoke about the collapse of Megiddo, the gradual deterioration, and then a crisis and destruction at the end of the late Bronze Age, in fact, into the beginning of the Iron One. The peak of this deterioration around 1100 BC.
Would you say that there is ever a true break?
Is
there an abandonment of the site?
No. There could have been a very short abandonment, but there's definitely not a break in the material culture. Which means, we'll speak about it in a minute, the material culture continues or recovers the material culture of the second millennium, of Canaanites, world of the second millennium. So, but the beginning of the recovery is slow and modest also. So we have some sort of a village here at Megiddo. I would say sometimes in the middle of the 11th century to the late 11th century, around 1050 BCE, perhaps a little bit before the recovery in the 11th century, but a small and modest village. And then this village develops into a major town, in fact, a very prosperous town. And we see this in every aspect of material culture. And this town, probably, the beginning of this prosperity, of this emergence of a town out of a village, can be put somewhere in the late 11th century, close to 1000 BC. And thereby afterwards, after maybe 50 years of prosperity or so, destruction. And the destruction is very dramatic. We'll speak about it at the end. It is radiocarbon dated today, quite accurately around the first decades of the 10th century, but it's not the end of the Iron One. This is important to mention. It's a phase in the Iron One, in the late Iron One, not the end of this phase. The terminology Iron One comes from, again, ceramic typology, right. But we are not committed to historical processes here, right? So this is basically the situation. At the end, a prosperous city.
Tell us about the material culture of this very prosperous city. I want to know everything. Pottery, flint, everything.
I suppose that this is the most important point, which was not known to us before. If we speak about archaeology maybe 40, 30 years ago, this was not very clear. The material culture of this city, of the late Iron One, around 1000 BC, a little bit after, is a complete recovery of what we knew before in the late second millennium. So Canaanite culture, if you wish, of the late second millennium. To the point that if you give me a test and put here, two assemblages, let's say, of pottery from the end of the late Bronze Age and from the end of the Iron One, about 2 centuries apart, I suppose that I will not be able to distinguish between them very clearly and very easily. And this goes for the entire package of material culture. The layout of the city is basically the same, with the palace in the same place and the temple in the same place. The temple, the big temple of Canaanite Megiddo, continues until the beginning of the 10th century. The cult objects look alike. Metallurgy continues in the same way, in the same location. Flint industry continues. Jewelry is basically the same as we knew before. The architecture of the houses, what we see on the rim of the site, so to speak, in the southeastern sector, is basically the same with these courtyard houses. So every aspect of material culture is the same as it used to be before, or continuity of what was there before. And this is the reason that at a certain moment I gave it a title, New Canaan. Yeah. I think it's not such a good title, because I should have given it a different name, Renewed Canaan.
Renewed Canaan.
Renewed Canaan is perhaps better. So this is the interlude between the city-states and the early Israel and the Northern Kingdom here at Megiddo, but the interlude is closer to what used to be than to what is going to happen.
Wow, so this is a renewed Canaan without the Egyptian control now.
Exactly. This is perhaps exactly the description, the right description. Canaanite without Egyptian control, and the main revolution in the material culture is going to happen after the destruction of this city.
Let's talk more about the destruction, because it's very dramatic. In places, the destruction is 2 meters thick.
And everywhere. We, the two of us, are already trained, and we walk around the site and we can point, we see the destruction, the red bricks, because of the big fire. By the way, the University of Chicago excavators gave it the title, the Red Brick City, because of this big destruction. The destruction is the mother of all destructions. I, in my career, have never seen something like this. I've never seen anywhere a big destruction, complete annihilation of the city.
What could destroy something like
exactly.
that?
So we have to understand this historically also. But first we need to say that, we archaeologists many times speak about destructions. Some of them are not exactly destructions. Some of them are light destructions, if I can say so, which means maybe partial destruction of a city. Sure. By the way, I think that when a big army comes, like the Assyrians, they are not a big orderly army with the king, at the head of the army. They don't come with knives, between their teeth, to kill them all also. They have a plan. They know what they want to achieve. So sometimes they come and they take out part of the city. They destroy, they hit the ruling elite, but not the entire place, because, sometimes an army comes to stay. So why destroy a city if you can really exploit it later?
Sure. Not to mention the logistic challenge of destroying a city by hand is crazy.
Right. But this, the destruction of the late Iron One is something different. And by the way, not only at Megiddo. We see it in the entire valley. There are destructions at Bet Shean and in other places. Yokneam, which is not so far behind us here to the north. Big destructions. But this one is really quite amazing. You described it correctly, collapse with fire and high temperature and vessels inside. This is a rich city. So, when we excavate it, we have beautiful finds, on the floors. It's really impressive. I mean, the tragedy of the past becomes impressive to us, archaeologists. And this is also the final act of Canaanite Megiddo, if you wish, of second millennium material culture, because what is going to emerge after a short gap in the 10th century, which means in the middle of the 10th century, something different is going to emerge, and there will be a revolution in material culture. All aspects that I spoke about 2-3 minutes ago will change completely over a period of several decades in the 10th century.
Wow. Do you find dead people in this destruction?
Yes, we do. We find here and there people who died perhaps after under the collapse, but more people who perhaps died and were interred in the city. And this is exceptional because burials under floors of buildings are well known in the Middle Bronze Age into the beginning of the Late Bronze Age, but not in the Iron One. And the fact that they did it in the Iron One is perhaps an indication that there was some sort of a bitter end, siege, emergency at the end.
Wow. So I have to ask you the most important question. Who or what destroyed the Megiddo?
This is a question, a straightforward question, but not very easy to answer. And we are struggling to answer this question. So first of all, we have to make a distinction between two possibilities or three possibilities. I mean, one could speak about an earthquake, a natural event. And there were voices in this direction in the past. I think that we do not have indication for this at Megiddo. I don't think that we can speak about a killer earthquake for a reason very simple, that we see that the destruction in the valley is not in the same moment. I'll be referring to it in a minute. Another possibility is a military campaign by a leader, by a general, so to speak, by a king. So in the early days of research, scholars were speaking about the Davidic conquest, Davidic wars, the phase of establishment of this mini empire of King David ruled from Jerusalem. We know that this is not acceptable for many reasons anymore, and we'll be speaking about it later in the series. So there is no great united monarchy. There is David, but there's no great empire with conquest from Jerusalem in the 10th century. Then there were voices, including me for a while, considering the possibility of destruction by a pharaoh, Sheshok I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty in Egypt. We know about him and about the campaign, first of all, from Egypt. We know about him also from the Bible under the title Shishak in the probably second half of the 10th century BC. But what stands against this, also against the earthquake theory, but also at the same time against one major campaign with destruction, is the evidence from radiocarbon. Because we do have now, we assembled evidence from several sites in the region, Megiddo, Yokneam, and other places, and we see in the western part of the valley and the eastern part of the valley, of the Jezreel Valley. And we see that these destructions did not come in the same moment. There is standard deviation, so to speak, difference between the destructions, which is too big to assume that we are dealing with the same event. Okay. So there were destructions in the valley along the 10th century. So we are dealing with the process rather than with an event. And then if it's a process, this limits very much the possibilities of understanding it. And I think that we are sort of channeled into one solution that I would call it the takeover of the valley by the Highlanders, which means Highlanders, I refer to the early Israelites, again coming from the same stock of people but organized socially and politically or geopolitically, if you wish, in a different way. And they start expanding from the highlands and they take over cities in the lowlands. And in fact, what we are watching, what we are seeing here, what we are referring to is the process which ultimately led to the rise of the northern kingdom of Israel and the control of the northern kingdom here and the making of Megiddo into a major administrative center of the northern kingdom.
Does anything from the biblical texts allude to this, give us any clues to this, explain this?
Yes. So this is a big question. And I suppose that very cautiously, I would say that perhaps the answer is in a way positive. You see, I'm cautious here. And I'll tell you why, because we are speaking about a big difference chronologically. There is no writing in ancient Israel of biblical texts, in my opinion at least, until 800 BC or so in the northern kingdom, and even later in Judah into the 7th century BC. So even if we are speaking about the early 8th century and early 8th century composition of a biblical text, we are still about a century and a half away or 2 centuries away from the events, and the question would be, how do they know, how do they remember? But still, I think that there is some sort of an echo which can be followed in two biblical records, I think, which can be traced perhaps in two biblical records. The first is in the first half of the book of Judges, in the Savior stories in Judges. These stories come from the northern kingdom. They were apparently put in writing for the first time sometimes in the 8th century, perhaps in the beginning of the 8th century, in the days of Jeroboam II, but they reflect back. And they reflect back on events that can be put on the reality of the days before the rise of the northern kingdom, I suppose, or in the early days. So we are in the 10th century BC. And there is one very good example in the valley. I refer here to chapters 4 and 5 in the book of Judges, telling us about confrontations in the valley. Chapter 4 is the prose, chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, the very well-known Song of Deborah. Scholars usually refer to these memories as reflecting on basically one event in the very early days. I suppose that we are dealing with two events, but in any way, Megiddo is mentioned in the Song of Deborah, together with Ta'anak, a little bit to the south of us. So there may be in the stories in chapters, in the story in chapter 4 and the song in chapter 5, an echo for unrest in the valley in the 10th century BC, perhaps with a question mark. Yeah. Okay. Another piece of information may come from the story in the stories in the book of Samuel about the days of King Saul and the fact that King Saul was involved all the way north to the Gilboa, Mount Gilboa, right, which is not so far from us, overlooking the valley, which means that the kingdom of Saul, well, the territorial entity ruled by perhaps an historical figure called Saul, which is an early Israelite, if you wish, territorial entity, sometime around the late 11th century, around 1000 BC, managed to spread all the way north to the margin of the Jezreel Valley, and the involvement here of Saul with Mount Gilboa is possibly another indication for the unrest in the valley in the beginning of the 10th century BC.
Great, so we can see with these destructions in the valley and this terrible destruction here at Megiddo, the end of an era, right? The end of the late Bronze Age proper, this Canaanite late Bronze Age, and the arrival of Israelites on the scene, which we can talk about next time.